they moved to a, excuse me. Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Crue Trime. Crue Trime. Crue Trime. If you are new here, you heard me right. It's Crue Trime, not true crime. My name is Sarah, and what I do here is tell you a terrible story to ruin your day and put on my makeup at the same time. So if that sounds like fun to you, you're in the right place. So make sure you subscribe to this channel, hit the bell notification, and then that way you will never miss one of my terrible stories. Before we get too deep into the story, a little bit of housekeeping. My Virgo tendencies to be so reliable and scheduled and predictable not been working out well lately. We've got a lot going on. I've been finishing up school, finally done, and dealing with a sick kitty cat. He's not feeling real great, and we've been dealing with that, so I might have to ratchet back a little bit until things kind of mellow out. So I do appreciate your patience while I live my life. That said, today's story is terrible. We are going back to dirty Jersey for this one. This is the thrill killer, Richard Biegenwald. One more thing, I don't really talk about the makeup as I'm using it, but if you're interested to see any of the things that I'm using, just look in the description box because I link everything so you can click it and go see what it is. Richard Fran Biegenwald was born on August 24th, 1940 in Staten Island, New York. He was the only child of Albert and Sally Biegenwald. Richard's childhood was, as you would expect, terrible. His father, Albert, whose right leg had been amputated after some kind of childhood train accident, was an alcoholic and had no interest in the family except to beat the shit out of Richard. By age 5, Mr. Young Child Richard was developing some extreme behavior issues. One being that he was a little bit of a firebug. In fact, he, set their house on fire.
We ain't gonna be in no fire, not today.
Well, following this house fire incident, young Richard was sent away to the Children's Psychiatric Center, it's almost empty, in Rockland County for observation. This was like the beginning of a long journey of reform schools and prisons. In 1948, 8-year-old Richard moved on to the Children's Village, a private school for disturbed children in Dobbs Ferry, New York. And Richard, by this time, had graduated to drinking alcohol and gambling.
I said, what?
8 years old.
I said, no.
You guys, at 8 years old, I was barely tying my own shoes, let alone, playing No Limit Texas Hold'em. Maybe he was rolling those dice. I don't know. At age 9, Richard was beginning to suffer from night terrors. He was also having extreme death fantasies, and they began electroshock therapy at New York's Bellevue Hospital. Electroshock therapy is sometimes called electroconvulsive therapy, is where doctors use electricity to induce a seizure meant to reset your brain, like the wonky part of your brain. It sounds really barbaric, but did you know they still do that today in the year of our Lord 2023? I mean, these days they put you to sleep first, but it's still a thing. Anyway, so after the 1948 version of electroshock therapy, Richard was sent to the State Training School for Boys in Warwick, New York. It's like they were trying to make him a serial killer. It's pretty much the recipe, isn't it? Okay, so it was around this time that Richard started to realize that if he was more compliant, that he would get let out of these places faster. He was a terrible student, but he was actually a really smart kid. So by age 8, Richard was back living with his mother in Staten Island.
If you don't know what Staten Island is, it's like New York's abortion that lived.
So young Richard was stealing and getting himself into trouble, setting things on fire, including himself. Pretty much just being a general menace. So on December 18th, 1958, the now 18-year-old Richard and a pal stole a car and decided to rob a grocery store in Bayonne, New Jersey. In the process of doing this, they shot and killed the owner, 47-year-old Stephen Sladowski. Now, was this a robbery? I mean, it looked like it could have been, but what happened was Richard, who was wearing a modified raincoat, they'd cut a hole in the sleeve for the gun to poke through. Well, he walked into the store and shot the man at close range with that sawed-off shotgun. He didn't grab any money or items from the store at all, but he did fire the shotgun one more time before they drove away in that stolen car. So witnesses who saw that last gunshot told the police that the robber was a tall, lean, tan guy with dark hair wearing a raincoat. But here's the fun part. Our pal Richard was a ginger. And having red hair and blue eyes is kind of a dead giveaway. So he actually put on a disguise for that robbery.
That's bad, man.
Psycho, but smart. Well, Richard and his accomplice went on the run and they ended up in Maryland. Okay, so during a routine traffic stop in Maryland, Richard panicked and shot the police officer in the face. The cop miraculously survived, and he was able to describe Richard and his friend. State troopers pretty quickly closed in, and then after a shootout, Richard and his friend were arrested. And the buddy confessed pretty much immediately. You know, he wasn't here to murder anybody, he was just here for a robbery, right? Well, Richard Biegenwald was ice cold and out of fucks. So he was convicted of murder and given a life sentence, and the end. I'm just kidding. Not even close to over. So in 1975, after being denied parole 4 previous times, Richard Biegenwald was released on parole after serving 17 whole years. His good behavior lasted honestly longer than I thought it would, about 2 years. Now, 35 years old, Richard was working as a house painter and in a series of body shops on Staten Island. By this time, he had met and began a romantic relationship with a 16-year-old girl named Diane Marcellus. Her dad hated Richard, as he should. You know, she's an actual child. And Richard was a 35-year-old man, convict, 35 years old, dating a 16-year-old? Come on. Stop. Okay, so in late 1977, Richard found himself in trouble again. He was in violation of the terms of his release after not showing up to see one of his parole officers. And he had also been accused of rape. Someone else, not his child girlfriend. So Richard was actually arrested in 1980 on that rape charge because the victim was able to make an incredible description. Whoever attacked her, you know, Richard, she got a really good look at him. But when it came time to do the police lineup, she couldn't pick him out. So the charge was dropped. Now that's infuriating, but in my research, our pal had red hair and blue eyes, so a pretty distinct look. But the night of the police lineup, he had shaved his head, disguised his look again, and dodged the charge. But he couldn't stay out of trouble, and he violated his parole, so he landed back in jail again a couple years later. I'm gonna put on eyebrows and I'll be right back. Okay, so on September 2nd, 1980, 40-year-old Richard and the now 21-year-old Diane were married in the Brooklyn jail. So romantic. Once he was free again the following February, the pair moved to a rooming house in Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, where he reconnected with an old jailhouse buddy, 52-year-old Darren Fitzgerald. And together, Rich and Darren got back up to their old tricks. Darren had served time for gun running, robbery, and smuggling bombs in cheese. Yeah, cheese bombs. This guy was a real piece of shit. Around May of 1982, Richard and Diane moved to Asbury Park, New Jersey. They settled into a 3-story Victorian house that was divided up into, you know, like different apartment units. The Biegenwalds and another female roommate, 22-year-old Teresa Smith, lived together in one unit, and Darren Fitzgerald was in another. The Biegenwalds worked as like the de facto property manager for the house, and they collected the rents from the other occupants, and they did the maintenance. I'm not really sure how many units were in the house, but it seems like more than 2. Anyways, the neighbors described them as, you know, an odd match. Diane was young and friendly and beautiful, and Richard was like a bedraggled creep. I mean, who knows? Maybe he had her hooked on drugs. Maybe she was just stigmatized. I don't know. Okay, so cut to the night of August 27th, 1982. 18-year-old Anna Elisowitz and her friend Denise Hunter drove from Camden, New Jersey to stay at Denise's uncle's house in Neptune City, which is right near Asbury Park. They were hanging out on the boardwalk in Asbury Park, sitting on a bench, listening to music coming out of a nearby club. They were celebrating the end of summer just before that they had to go back to school for the fall. So Denise stepped away for a moment to use the restroom, and when she came back, Anna was gone. She thought maybe that she'd wandered into a bar or a shop, something like that. She couldn't find her, so she went back to the house. And when Anna wasn't at the house, she knew something was wrong, so she called the police to report that she was missing. So on January 14th, 1983, about 5 months later, Anna's body was discovered by some kids in a vacant lot behind the Burger King in Ocean Township. Since the body was essentially a skeleton, investigators had to use dental records to confirm the identity, and the cause of death was easily determined to be homicide, although she was a skeleton. She had 4 bullet wounds in her skull. 3 of the bullets were still lodged in the bone. Anna's skeleton was still wearing the clothes described in her missing persons report, except a very distinctive black and gold ring was missing from her finger. Now, this was like all over the news. It was being publicized everywhere. Police and investigators were seeking information from the public, wherever they could get it from. A week after Anna's body was discovered, Richard's 22-year-old roommate, Teresa Smith, went to the police. Why would she do that? Teresa previously worked as a waitress with Richard's wife, Diane. That's how she met the Biegenwalds. Diane had later moved on to work at the hospital, where she would, steal drugs for all of them to share. By the way, she and Diane had become friends, and, she later moved into a basement apartment in the house. No surprise at all, Teresa was also in a sexual entanglement with Richard Biegenwald.
An entanglement?
Yes.
Were they a throuple? Maybe. The point is, Teresa had an insider's perspective of the goings-on in the Biegenwald home, including that it was stockpiled with all kinds of contraband like drugs and guns and secret rooms. Richard had taken an interest in grooming young Teresa to be his murder protege. And they had been planning to murder one of her other co-workers, Betsy, as practice or to prove her toughness, whatever. She told police that Richard often took her out to the woods to fire guns and also to the boardwalk and local malls to look for victim-like people, like teenagers, but she always found an excuse to not be present when there was a killing. So it was happening. They had been killing people. The very night that Anna Elisowitz disappeared from that boardwalk in Asbury Park, August 27th, 1982, Teresa had been out driving with Betsy, thinking about how she was going to kill her, but then she chickened out. She called Richard to tell him, and then she went home for the night, and Richard was pretty pissed off. So she's at home, she's in bed. Richard shows up in the night and tried to wake her up, but she was so drugged up that she couldn't do anything and just fell back asleep. The next day, when she got home from work, Richard took her out back to the garage. He said he needed to show her something. Hidden under a mattress was a female body. Spoiler alert, it was Anna Elisowitz. There was a green plastic bag over her head tied tight around the neck. He said, "You were supposed to kill someone last night, so I brought this woman home for you. You wouldn't get out of bed, so I had to do it myself." What? Richard told Teresa to touch the body, tell him how it felt.
What was your reaction to touching that body?
How did I feel?
Yeah.
Sick.
So Richard told her that he had met this young girl on the boardwalk. He told her that he had some weed. Would she like some? She says yes. She comes with him. Of course, his ruse to get her in the car so he could bring her home for Teresa to murder. Oh my God. Well, when he got home and Teresa was asleep, she wouldn't wake up, so he shot her. Anna, I mean. After that, Richard got his homie, Darren Fitzgerald, to help him dispose of the body. Teresa apparently came to her senses and moved out of the Biegenwald house shortly after that. But not before he gave Teresa a ring. He had taken that black and gold ring from Anna's finger. Teresa later claims that she didn't know where the ring came from, blah, blah, blah.
Isn't it a fact that you saw a ring on your body and said you wanted that ring for yourself?
No, that's not.
You never requested to have that ring?
No.
But she wore that ring for a solid month before, she moved out of that house. She actually ended up giving it to Diane, Richard's wife. After she moved out, she got herself a new boyfriend. She got clean from drugs, and she was, trying to get her life together. But when Anna's body was discovered and she saw everything on the news, she decided to spill her guts to the police. She described the condition of Anna's body, the gunshot that was in the head, the description, what she was wearing, everything. She gave police enough information to issue a search warrant for Richard Biegenwald's house. Okay, so on January 22nd, 1983, police surrounded Richard Biegenwald's home. They lured him out of his house using some kind of trick, and when he stepped off his back porch, they swarmed. Shitbag Darren Fitzgerald heard this ruckus, and he hid himself in a secret room in the house, a room that he used to grow like pot plants and keep illegal weapons, and his poisonous snake, a guard snake. Can you imagine? Once the police were inside and threatened to shoot him through the wall, he surrendered. So when police searched the house, they found this wild assortment of all kinds of criminal shit that Teresa had told them all about. They found crazy, handmade weapons, automatic weapons that were illegal, floor plans for local banks and stores, ammunition, pipe bombs, drugs, all the things. A smorgasbord. They also found the black and gold ring in Diane's jewelry box, the one that belonged to Anna. In Darren Fitzgerald's apartment, they found what was later determined to be the weapon that killed Anna Olisowicz. So that day, the police arrested everyone who lived in that Asbury Park house. Richard and Diane Biegenwald, Darren Fitzgerald, and his girlfriend, Kathy Bertucci, and her daughter. During the interrogation at the police station, Richard's good pal and accomplice, Darren Fitzgerald, told them everything. He told them how he helped Richard dispose of the body in a wooded area behind the Burger King in Ocean Township. Why would Darren rat out his good friend, Richard, you ask? Darren was a piece of shit, for starters, but also he told police that Richard killed his cat. I mean, reasonable. I would burn it all down if somebody ever touched my precious Murray or my little goosey.
Or you can die screaming alongside!
Yeah, well, Darren had a lot to say. He told police the location of 2 more bodies in New Jersey, a drug dealer and a teen girl. And another body was at Richard's mother's home in Staten Island, buried in the backyard. Darren said that he never asked any questions about why the victims had been killed. He was just there to help dispose. Sure. Okay. So in that relatively brief time that Richard Biegenwald had been out of prison, at this point, only 8 years, he had been busy. So here's the order of the actual crimes, but the bodies were discovered in a different order. In June of 1978, Richard was out shooting tin cans in an abandoned airfield in Flemington, New Jersey with his friend, 57-year-old John Patrone. They had met while serving time together in Rahway State Prison in the late 60s. Patrone was also a state snitch and was maybe trying to extort money from Richard's mother, so Richard shot him, stuffed him in the trunk of his car, drove him out to the woods at Collier's Mills Wildlife Preserve, and buried him in a shallow grave. On Halloween night of 1981, 17-year-old Maria Cialella set out to enjoy an evening of spooky tricks and treats. When she was walking home later that evening around midnight, she was picked up by Biegenwald, shot, dismembered, and buried at Richard's mother's house in Staten Island. On September 8th, 1982, Richard abducted and murdered Virginia Clayton. She was found 3 days after John Patrone's body was discovered and within 4 miles of that burial site. On April 8th, 1982, Richard stabbed 17-year-old Deborah Osborne of Seaside Heights to death. He then took her body to his mother's house in Staten Island and buried her right on top of where he buried Maria Cialella.
Nah, there's good people everywhere, but like not in Staten Island at all.
So Richard's next victim we already know about was Anna Elisowitz in August of 1982. But in the time after her murder, but before he was arrested in January, he had killed 2 more people. So William Ward was a drug dealer and a prison escapee who Darren claims that Richard shot in broad daylight at the home in Asbury Park, New Jersey. This was in September 1982. And lastly was Betsy Bacon, Teresa's co-worker, remember? She actually disappeared on November 20th, 1982. 42-year-old Richard Biegenwald was charged with the murder of Anna Elisowitz, in addition to a host of other drug and weapons charges. He pled not guilty. Shocking. Richard's 23-year-old wife, Diane, was charged also with a list of crimes, but ended up entering into a plea agreement, having been pregnant at the time of the arrest. Good old Darren Fitzgerald was also charged with Anna's murder, but he cut a deal that dropped the charge in exchange for his testimony against Richard at the trial. Now, can I just tell you that Darren Fitzgerald has one of the most punchable faces I have ever seen. The footage of his testimony looks like the cheesiest mob movie impersonation that you've ever seen.
So I assisted him in loading the body into the trunk of the car and drove up Sunset Avenue to Route 35, across the highway, and there's a turnoff on the left. It's the first, I believe, after the Burger King parking lot.
Is he trying to be Robert De Niro, or do people really talk like that? At trial, the prosecution's case was largely centered around the testimony provided by both Darren and Teresa. Richard's defense claimed that Darren was an admitted contract killer and he murdered Anna. And the 3 other inmates at Trenton State Prison that claimed that they'd heard Darren bragging about the murder when he was still being held, before he started seeing the news and headlines, before he negotiated that plea deal. Anyways, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before they returned unanimous verdicts, guilty on all charges. And after the verdict was reached, the penalty phase began. Well, Richard Biegenwald's defense brought in a psychiatrist to testify what you'd expect to hear regarding mitigating factors, circumstances that could justify some sort of reduced sentence, that Richard was abused as a child, institutionalized at age 8, in prison by the time he was 18, and just out of his mind, blah, blah, blah. But in preparing for this insanity defense, the psychiatrist recognized all of these factors, but still determined that Richard was not legally insane. He just lacked the emotional capacity to appreciate his wrongfulness or conform his behavior to law, which, considering he knew to conceal the bodies and the crimes, make it make sense. The state argued, aggravating factors, things that make the offense more severe, that the crime was savage, it was cruel, it involved torture, depravity of the mind, meaning that there was no other reason than just wanting to do it for funsies. The jury found that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating factors and recommended that Richard Biegenwald be sentenced to death. Richard was remitted to the New Jersey State Prison to begin his sentence, and in 1987, Biegenwald's conviction was upheld, but the death penalty was reconsidered. A second jury was assembled in 1989, and they also recommended the death penalty. But an appeal was filed on the basis that the voir dire process was not adequate. You know, basically that the jurors were not vetted properly and the death sentence was again vacated, but instead 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole were imposed. Did I just say possibility? Possibility of parole. Yes, exactly that. So in March of 2008, the 67-year-old Richard Biegenwald fell ill and he was hospitalized at the St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. On March 10th, 2008, Richard Biegenwald died of respiratory and kidney failure. You might remember this case popping up in the news as recent as 2016. I guess that's not recent at all, but there was some kind of work, some kind of construction renovation work going on at Richard Biegenwald's mother's former home in Staten Island, or maybe it was one of the other homes that he lived in New Jersey. Either way, they thought they found bones, like human bones, but they just turned out to be animal bones, you know, like a dog or something. Were there more victims? I'm thinking probably yes, but we'll never know. And that is the story of the thrill killer, Richard Biegenwald. Again, if you're interested to know any of the makeup that I used in today's look, just look down in the description box. I will link everything that is still available. If it's not available, I will link something similar. If you have a Crue Trime story that you would like to recommend to me, there's also a Google Doc down in the description box. You can fill it out with all of the gory details. I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out today and for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this one, then consider subscribing to this channel before you leave today. I upload new videos here on YouTube every week? Question mark? I'm doing my best. You can follow me on most of the other socials as well. That is it for now. I will catch you next time in the next video. Bye! Got way too much. Oh no. Look at how much blush I put on myself. Who am I? Got a little aggressive there. My bad. Oh no, I just dropped my brush. Asbury perk. Glitter all over my face. Oh my god. Fuck. God, I'm trying to get the last little bit of this out of here. Is that too pale? Shut up. Why do I never have my brushes ready?